like to take a moment to say thank you to everyone who checked out the first episode. It's been really cool hearing everyone's reactions and seeing the interest and support right away. It means a lot to us.
Yeah, we were talking about it earlier through DM, and you were saying what a great start to the release day, and someone already pledged $10 a month to it. So thank you. You know who you are. Like we're not looking for a lot, but having your eyes and ears on our work means a lot because sometimes it feels like we're shouting into the ether, but you guys are listening, and I hope you continue to enjoy what we put out.
Yeah, totally. And if you do want to support us, that's really cool too. You can support us, monetarily, sure, by subscribing. There's a link in the bio for that, but you can also just support us by reaching out and sharing it with other people, because ideally what we want is just people to hear us talk about like the reality of being a freelance artist.
One of the things that I hear a lot from peers and colleagues is how if they had the art school experience, they miss it. They miss the camaraderie and having someone's eyes on your work constantly. And if they haven't, it's because they really want to experience that. So I think Az and I are in agreement that part of this is just kind of like opening up the platform and giving us like this shared knowledge base, because it really is hard to find people who are doing the same work that you're doing, especially as an artist.
Totally. Well, now that we've got that out of the way, Ash, have you ever written a fan fiction?
Oh, have I ever? Yes. Yeah, I have. Don't you dare look it up.
I mean, you don't have to give away anything you don't want to say, but what was your fan fiction about? Or what kind of, if you don't want to talk about that, what brought up the idea to write a fan fiction?
I started writing very young. Like, my introduction to like communication was the internet. Like most of my friends were online growing up, and when you're nerdy and your peer group is entirely virtual, I think you tend to lean towards like nerdy subcultures, and part of being in a nerdy subculture is creating content for it, and that's fan art and fan fiction. I did everything.
I want to like take a moment to distinguish between fan art and fan fiction. I feel like fan art, everyone does fan art. That's pretty normal. I think if you like something, you're going to draw it. As artists, how many times have I drawn Fox Mulder? Because what a weird face. I love David Duchovny's face, but and you as a caricature artist, you draw people's faces all the time. That's a form of fan art. Mm-hmm. But fan fiction, I feel like it exists in a separate realm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, writing and visual arts are already separate. I think like the larger umbrella is just that they're content that's being made as fans of a certain like intellectual property,
Right. I think maybe what I'm trying to get at is like the amount of effort that goes into fan fiction versus fan art kind of creates this separate subculture and separate attitudes towards it. So for the record, I also wrote fan fiction. It's how I started out as a writer, and I think a lot of writers would actually say the same thing, because I actually did research this time. I wanted to read this message on Quora, which is never a good start to a sentence. But essentially, I'm not going to say the name of the person who wrote this, but they wrote this list of reasons why fan fiction sucks. And I wanted to bring that up because I think it kind of encompasses the attitude a lot of people who dislike fan fiction, which might be quite a few people, they feel the same way. So like one of the things it says is all fan fiction sucks. A character is an author's child, not a puppet for you to play with. Fan fiction simply steals an author's creation. It's lazy, and some fanfic writers are wasting their talent. So I read this and I thought it was so funny because I realized how much of that actually applies to stuff that isn't fan fiction. Like, how much do we write that is borrowing or that is not necessarily stealing, but influenced by other things? And I think that's what I want to talk about most today is just where do we draw the line between fan fiction and inspiration?
I don't know, man. I suppose I could start off with that, painfully famous quote: "Good artists copy, great artists steal." What hasn't already been touched upon? Like, human beings have been around for millennia. Like, for every single motif or theme or like character archetype, it's already been explored to oblivion. We have to borrow from other people always, right? So, like, while I
Right.
can understand being against fan fiction, like that doesn't matter to me. Like, that's a preference, but ultimately, whether you're creating content that's 100% your own or you are creating content that celebrates someone else's work, you're still, you get what I'm saying, right?
Sure. I'm just, so I wrote down a couple of fan fictions that I think would sort of test that theory of borrowing versus creating. Okay. So
Okay.
what would you say is like the most popular fan fiction ever written?
My Immortal.
For people who don't know, would you care to explain what My Immortal is?
Oh, you just shared that TikTok with me too, of that girl that just read off all of my. Okay, so My Immortal is a Harry Potter fan fiction on fanfiction.net that is horribly written and I'm pretty sure satire, but it's basically, a self-insert main character. Her name is Ebony. She has pale skin and dark black hair, and she's a vampire. Can't forget that she's a vampire. And like,
Ebony
she
Raven
just.
Way.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
That's important.
I feel bad, you got to say her whole name. It's like, yeah. Anyway, the entire series is basically just, her with all of her like foibles and love. Like, all of the characters in the entire cast either loves her or doesn't love her, and she like plays with their hearts, and there's a lot of stuff about her being a vampire.
Okay, yeah. So that I would say might be the most memed fan fiction. At least it's definitely popular in the sense that most people recognize the name.
Was there like an actual correct answer that I totally missed? Because I feel like it's My Immortal.
No. There's different ways to answer this question,
Right.
of course. So like your answer, I mean, there's no right or wrong answer to the question of popularity, but I was actually going to say the most commercially successful, which would be, or the most commercially popular, which would be 50 Shades of Grey.
50 Shades of Grey is fan fiction?
Yes, you did not know that?
I don't know anything about 50 Shades of Grey. I was in high school when like all of that was popping, so I couldn't even watch the movies, so I didn't decide to care about it.
Oh, sure. Well, I read all the books because it's really bad writing, but in a very entertaining way. Just the same way that I like hate read a lot of other fan fiction, but it's a
Sure.
Twilight fan fiction. It was actually published on fanfiction.net, and it was
No
like,
way.
yeah, it totally is.
What?
Yeah, but some other fan fictions that have also been like really successful. A Study in Emerald, which is a Neil Gaiman short story, I think it was, or like a not novella. A lot of Neil Gaiman's books actually, or a lot of Neil Gaiman's writing is fan fiction. I mean, he wrote episodes of Doctor Who, which are arguably fan fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But A Study in Emerald is a mashup of Sherlock Holmes and H.P. Lovecraft. And it won awards, like it was really successful. And another one I was going to bring up was Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which is Seth Grahame-Smith. He wrote a couple of other books in that vein, but also like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, I think it was. Both of those became movies. I don't know if I'd call them successful, but Pride and Prejudice and Zombies does have my favorite casting of what's his name in Pride and Prejudice, the cousin that nobody likes.
Oh God, I'm the wrong person to ask.
Damn it. I'm blanking on his name right now. How many times have I read and watched Pride and Prejudice and I'm blanking on his name? But it's Matt Smith cast in the role, and I think he's great in that role. Speaking of Doctor Who and fan fiction. And then here's one that I wanted to bring up because I truly believe this is fan fiction, and I don't think people talk about it enough. Um, the 1997 film written and directed by James Cameron by the name of Titanic, I think might be the biggest fan fiction ever written.
I know you. I know where you're gonna steer this conversation.
Guys, about
guys,
Titanic?
I gotta air some of Az's dirty laundry. She showed me to scale replica of the Titanic in Minecraft.
Oh my gosh, we can talk about people making stuff in Minecraft all day long and how that is basically fan art. But no, I mean, I'm dead serious. The movie Titanic, it is a fan fiction. I mean, it's based on true events, it's based on true people, but it has an entirely fictionalized plot within it, which I think is exactly what other fan fiction does.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Because some of these examples feel more like historical fiction rather than fan fiction. My understanding of fan fiction is you are like basically, you know, like rebooting or doing a spin-off of someone else's like project or like, you know, their show, their book, whatever. Historical fiction is like taking actual events and mythologizing them a little bit.
Yeah, I think actually Titanic could lean more towards historical fiction. The only reason I bring up the fan fiction part of it is because there are real people in it. It's not entirely fictionalized. Whereas Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is 100% fan fiction. It is 100% taking another story and then just adding an element or changing it in a small way. The same thing with like Bridget Jones' Diary, which is almost entirely a ripoff of Pride and Prejudice. Not saying that in a bad way. I'm just saying like his name is literally Darcy in Bridget Jones' Diary. Like it's quote unquote inspired by. And I think that inspired by part is what really gets me when it comes to fan fiction. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like what this is all leading to is like we've already accepted fan fiction in other forms at a commercial and kind of like widely accessible level. So why is it once it's in the hands of independent creators and it's like on a smaller scale, we tend to turn our noses up at it? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
I think so. I think that is exactly what I'm getting at. I'm glad you're clarifying that for me because I think the stigma is coming from how much money is behind the project. I mean, how many people are investing in it? And when you have something like a movie that had commercial success, like 50 Shades of Grey, that had all this money behind it, it was very successful, but it was also pretty successful when it was still quote unquote a Twilight fan fiction on a website. I mean, the reason it became a movie was because E.L. James self-published it and she got the audience and she got the reaction.
That's quite interesting. Like, see, I feel like a lot of the nose turning up behavior is kind of like infighting. Like, now we're gonna get into like fandom culture. Are you okay with delving into that a little bit?
Oh, please. That's what we're here for, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can't speak for you, but I assume your experience is similar. But I grew up belonging to a lot of different fandoms, and that was a pretty substantial part of my upbringing from my teen years to like maybe 20, 21 is when I started kind of like dropping off from that. But like being on Tumblr and consuming media and content from specific shows or fandoms. Should we explain what a fandom is?
Yeah, please.
A fandom is like a body of fans for like you know, like let's say Star Wars. You're a huge fan of Star Wars. You have like a bunch of Star Wars drapes and bath curtains in your house and you really think Kylo Ren is the sexiest man alive, you would probably belong to the Star Wars fandom. And if you utilize your access to that fandom, it means interacting with people who feel very similarly, have a similar passion for Star Wars, and like you can consume and create content. And belonging to that in group, that fandom specifically, makes you feel like you're participating in something. And that's why I think fan fiction and fan art are so important. They're so crucial, is because you're creating another sort of like resource, this, I don't want to say commercial, but like you're putting out more content for people, deriving it from something that is static. Like if let's say you're a fan of something very obscure niche, like this movie that came out in the 90s, and you found your group of people, like that's done. Like that had its moment in history, and like no more money's being funded into it. So you are drawing every resource from the thing that you're inspired by to create more content for it. And that's pretty cool. It rejuvenates it, it keeps it alive, and it's existed in other forms prior to the internet.
Totally. I mean, I read Star Wars novelizations in high school. They are fan fiction. I mean, talk about, like George Lucas said, no, these are not canon, but you know, in the books, Han Solo and Leia have twins who become like powerful with the Force, and you could probably argue that a lot of that inspired what ended up being the sequel trilogy. I was going to say that all of that is pretty, you know, hitting the nail on the head, but especially the community part. So as I stated previously, I did used to write fan fiction. And I'm not ashamed to say that it was My Chemical Romance fan fiction. Is that embarrassing? Probably, but I mean, it genuinely, like, that's what got me into writing. And I'm not ashamed of that, especially because of the community that grew around it. So My Immortal, this kind of comedic long story, does have some like My Chemical Romance fan fiction inspiration, I should say.
Yes, it does.
And you know, I was on a website, I was in a community that was all dedicated to My Chemical Romance fan fiction. And I met some of my favorite people in the whole world on that website. And at the time in high school, when I was that nerd reading Star Wars novelizations in the corner and didn't really talk to a lot of people, those were my best friends. I mean, they were people that I actually, they might be what I would consider like what you and I have now, or what us and other art school graduates have, this sort of like critique community. That's what I had as a teenager when I was writing. And would I have found that without fan fiction? I don't think so.
Yeah, it's kind of, I hate referring to it as a journey, but like anything that's in service to your journey, if it takes you where you're meant to be, you can call it cringy, it's not necessarily wrong, but I feel like it detracts from the fact that like that was basically your gateway into something very important to you. Like growing up, I was always creatively inclined, and I wrote stories even prior to writing fan fiction because I took creative writing classes in like middle school, and my teachers encouraged it, and it was a good outlet for me to get my thoughts and my feelings out. Like if that's inspiring you to create, I see nothing wrong with that. Like fuel is fuel. What I'm more concerned with is output. Like, are you, you know, honoring your voice as an artist and making work that you're proud of? Doesn't matter what the content is.
Totally. I mean, who's proud of their first story? I'm not sure a lot of people can say they are. Do you remember what your first story was?
I've had so many growing up. One that comes to mind is okay. Just so you know, I always loved vampires growing up. I dressed up as a
You are
vampire
a
every
vampire,
year for Halloween.
so that's why.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I am very vampire-esque. But I never got into Twilight. You know, I was like one of those hipster kids that's like, I'm not gonna like what everyone else likes. I listen to Deftones. So this wasn't inspired by Twilight, but it's pretty Twilight adjacent. I had a story I was writing about like these groups of vampires, like these vampire families, and like they were like out to kill each other, and like you've heard it before. We've all heard it before. The classic vampire family out to kill each other trope.
Sure.
That was my first story. I was probably like 10 or 11. Do you remember yours?
Oh, absolutely. I remember it so well, because the first time I read a story was actually in a creative writing class, and I won an award for it. No big deal. I was 8 years old and there were only 10 people in the class, so winning an award was not a big deal. But it was about, and stop me if this sounds familiar, a professor who was mixing ingredients and accidentally created superhuman, superpowered twins with the powers of fire and ice. And why does that sound familiar? Because it's Powerpuff Girls. That's exactly what I wrote the first time I ever wrote a story.
You told me to stop you when it sounds familiar, and I nearly stopped you at the word professor.
Are you about to air some more dirty laundry for me? Please don't.
No. It's in reference to one of her comics that are coming up, and you should look out for it because it's very exciting stuff.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that might actually be the first story, that comic that I'm writing right now, the first story that wasn't purely fan fiction that I ever wrote.
Right on. And you should actually talk about that a little bit.
Why?
Oh, you don't have to. I think the story behind the comic that you're writing is so fascinating because you've been working on it for so long, and it is writing.
Well, I guess I can bring up sort of something I wanted to talk about, which is, I mean, when we talk about fan fiction, we talk about taking things that already exist and sort of tweaking them a little bit in our own way. And there are some fan fictions that you could say are, what is it, like putting yourself in the story? I recently learned what Y/N means, because apparently there's a whole like fan fiction TikTok subculture where it's like imagining scenarios with celebrities where it's like, but picture yourself in the situation and you feel those feelings that you would maybe feel if this were reality, I guess.
To those of you out here who are fortunate enough not to know what YN stands for, it's your name, and it's used in reader insert fiction. It's usually like, Sephiroth like takes your hand and he's like, YN, will you be my blank? My husband blank.
Precisely. It's a self-insert. That's the word I wanted to bring up. But so this story for me that I'm working on right now, I'm not going to say it's a self-insert, but it is sort of how I have been processing the first like 10 years of my life as an adult who like isn't in high school anymore, basically. So I started writing the story shortly after I finished high school, and the like events of my life beginning in 2012 to today is just so chaotic. I'm not even going to go into it, but I've been using the story as a sort of way to like organize it, process it, and as a result create these characters that perhaps represent parts of me that I wanted to understand better, but also essentially, I mean, it's a story about heartbreak, and everyone in this story experiences a form of heartbreak that I think I can safely say I have also experienced. So I'm using fictional characters to process, real life experiences, which I think a lot of writers do. And that could possibly be where the fan fiction line comes in, because I think when you use fan fiction, when you use characters that exist, whether it's real people who already exist or characters from another story that already exists, you are given this sort of template to work with, and a lot of the work is taken out by, having a character that already has a personality or that already has a name. I don't know. That was my experience as a fan fiction writer, I guess, is what I'm getting at. Like, for me, the fan fiction that I liked reading was the sort that like you could change the names and it would just be another story. It would just be another book. It wouldn't necessarily be a fan fiction.
Yeah,
that makes sense?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, I'm digesting here. I really like what you had to say about it. It kind of reminds me of my own experience with writing. I've been writing my whole life. Like, that's probably one of those hobbies that I don't think I've ever given up on. Like I've been doing it diligently like my whole life. And it brings me a lot of comfort because I don't necessarily do it for any reason other than I enjoy doing it. Um, but suffice it to say, I've gone through a lot of different types of writing. I've done poetry before, and I've definitely done fan fiction. I've done prose, trying to write like my own like novels, and I've done a lot of diaries and like self-reflection, and that's my favorite type of writing to do. I've got like 50 documents on my computer right now. They're just full of thoughts that I scramble out of my head out whenever I need a little like lobotomy, get some of those thoughts out of my head. Um, and the interesting thing is I do that so I can like comprehend specific problems I'm facing in my life. They're usually like big, heady problems that are existential in nature, and I can't ever hope to really figure them out. So I just kind of like word vomit into a document. And I'm like, well, this is cathartic, but what am I getting out of this? Like, I'm having a conversation with myself. And that's where the transition into original content is actually quite divine. Because when you have two characters that you're forcing to go through these same dilemmas, they are their own characters who you've already fleshed out, and you can have their personalities interact in a way where you have to address that problem from a different angle. And I find it is like a form of problem solving. So it's a lot of like work, a lot of mental effort to create a compelling dynamic between characters that, you know, touch on these themes that might be important to you as a person. But like once you figure it out and once you do it regularly, I find it's kind of like it's like a daily learning ritual almost. Like I'm learning myself better, I'm learning storytelling better, and yeah, like it goes beyond catharsis at that point. It feels a little bit more productive.
I like that you brought up journaling, because I think when you write every day and you don't necessarily write in the service of a story or a project, where you just like the physical act of moving your hand and writing something out, it's meditative, and it's almost like a form of prayer, I think.
Mm-hmm.
um when you write things out, and you know me, I like to write down my dreams, which are probably my brain's way of making fan fiction of itself, just like taking real life information and making some bizarre story out of it. But that act of, like you said, problem solving and creating, that does trigger parts of your brain that I think it's that like frontal lobe part of your brain that makes you use critical thinking and connecting things and making conclusions, that when you start writing as a, I don't know how old you were, 8, 9, maybe.
I have no clue.
you don't have that capacity in your brain. You don't have that critical thinking part of your brain. And some of the stories I came up with as a kid, how, I don't know. I remember I wrote a story about some kids that were in a helicopter crash and had to survive the forest. Like, it was a video game, but in a 8-page story form that didn't make any sense.
Sounds like Lord of the Flies.
Kind of. I think it was after I read Hatchet, and I was like, oh man, this is so cool. I want to write a story like that.
Sure.
Reading that kind of stuff too young, probably, but I wrote another story. This is the one that really gets me. I don't know where my brain came up with this, but it was a story about a WNBA player who has a daughter and she gets cancer. That's the whole premise. I don't know where that came from, but did it end up being a good story? Absolutely not. Excuse me. We're gonna keep this clean. I'll bleep that out. Absolutely not. No, it was. I don't think I ever like wrote a comprehensive story, because that's just such a weird and I think emotionally complex thing for an 8 or 9-year-old to write about. I'm pretty sure the whole quote unquote story was just me writing, there's a mom who's in the WNBA and she gets cancer, on a piece of paper, and that was the story.
I don't know. Like, I'm not trying to take it there, but I think that kids have this intrinsic darkness to them that like they don't really know how to articulate because like life is still so like colorful and like new to you as you're growing up. Like I don't know about you, but I remember combating feelings of like being small and confused a lot as a kid because I didn't really understand what was going on in my life. Like I knew there were these things that I had to complete because my parents expected it of me, but like, why am I here? Why am I doing this? I was always very existential. And I would like draw comics and like turn writing assignments, even in elementary school, into that. And I
Hmm.
remember having these conversations with teachers, and they're like, "Oh, Ash, do we need to contact your parents?" And it's like, no, 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 I'm fine. I'm a very
Yeah.
well-adjusted child, but I think that everyone grapples with some of this stuff, no matter how old you are. So I don't know. I wouldn't really overthink it.
That's a good point. So I don't know if you have a lot of young kids around you on a daily basis, but I have two nieces, and one of them is 4 right now, and playing with her, like role playing with her, is some of the craziest stuff I've ever heard a kid say. I mean, she will like, you know, 3 and 4 year olds, their brains are going 5,000 miles an hour, and they'll start this game and then they'll switch it in the moment. Like, no, 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 we're not playing that anymore. We're playing this. Duh, keep up. But there was one time where we were playing, and she was like, "Okay, so you're the daughter, but your mommy isn't here." And I was like, "Okay, why isn't my mommy here? Like, where is she? Is she at work?" And she's like, "No, your mommy's dead." I was like, "Oh, okay, that's a bummer. What happened?" And she's like, "I don't know, but your mommy's dead, and that's her ghost." And I was like, "Okay, this is interesting. Where did you learn about ghosts?" Like, I'm just trying to follow her logic and see like where it came from. And you don't always figure out where kids learn the things they do, but I think it's like it's interesting how their brains can make those like logical connections pretty young.
Well, I think it's because they're aware of them. It's like life experience and trauma that like that's where we start applying like negative connotations to some of these things. But like when you're a kid, they're just words. Like
True.
you think that you've experienced a ghost or you heard about how someone's like, cousin died. Like it's still very foreign. Like like you haven't had personal experience with this. You don't understand it and you're not old enough to comprehend it. So I think it's pretty innocent. Like, you know, unless you're getting into territory of like childhood trauma, in which case definitely keep an eye on that. Um, but like, yeah, I think a lot of it is just kids grappling with these ideas that are too big for them. They're like, well, I heard someone mention death, and like, mommy's been crying because of her grandma. Like, I don't really know what it means, but now
Mm-hmm,
I know what
mm-hmm.
death is.
Right. And I think you know that's why like I love playing with kids. I love playing with 3 and 4 year olds, or just like that developmental toddler stage, because what they're doing through through acting to play acting, it's that they're processing information that they learn throughout the day.
Yeah.
um that's literally why kids play, is so that they can sort of reenact and understand the roles that they're experiencing around them. And I think that's what writers do, and what artists in general do. I mean, we're taking that sort of playtime activity and then putting it down on paper. At least in my experience, I mean, that's why I write, is to sort of neatly categorize and understand all this weird and insane stuff in my brain that I call feelings.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you made that connection because it's the same for me. And that kind of reminded me of fan fiction again, because fan fiction is playing with these roles. Like, it's kind of nice. You're given like a limited palette, like you're working within this universe that already exists within those constraints. What kind of like creative potential is there? Like, there are some really good fan fictions out there that could be serialized and like sold as like offshoot, like think about the Star Wars novellas. Like a lot of that could have been like fan fiction writers who got hired by Lucasfilms. You never know. But I don't know. I think it's interesting that we need those outlets to explore concepts that are still foreign to us, cuz like Some of it is lived experience, some of it is experience that we want to live, but we simply cannot. So not only are you like practicing your artistic chops, you're giving your brain the leeway to explore something it otherwise couldn't.
Right. That's sort of, I like that you brought up constraints, because I think what I'm trying to get at is when you have those constraints, or rather when you're trying to deal with these crazy things that are like ethereal or complex in a way that you don't understand, sometimes you need those anchors. So I used to, well, I have a tattoo that's a cover up, and I don't tell people what the cover up is, but it was a Jack White inspired tattoo, because Jack White, I was a big fan of the White Stripes in high school. I still am. But I was like obsessed with the White Stripes. And there was this one thing that Jack White would always talk about, is that he would work in everything was in a reference of three, because like he claimed to need this restraint of the number three in order to force himself to be more creative. So he would go in progressions of three, or only write three lines in a chorus, or stuff like that. You know, like he had to stick to the number three, and everything had to revolve around the number three, because that constraint forced him to think outside the box in a way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you know how the tagline, or I don't know where it appears on Archive of Our Own, which is another really big fan fiction website. But they say brevity is the soul of wit. And brevity is just like using as few words as possible to get your point across, which is a constraint. I think that's one of the biggest things, no matter what your creative discipline is. You learn the most when you're given restraints. In one of our materials and techniques classes back at MCAD, we had an assignment where we were only allowed to use one material and make an entire comic out of it, which like sounds like a nightmare. But our professor, bless his heart, he encouraged us to do things that we would never think to make a comic with. Like he talked about artists that, well, I should say students back then that use like twigs to ink their entire comic, or like sponges, and it came up with really interesting results. So the more you experiment and the more you put constraints on yourself, you'll see like what the natural shine of your materials are. Like you'll find that the twig will be kind of like scratchy and give you this like grungy, very geometric or fluid design, versus like the sponge is going to be very airy and it's going to be hard to define form. Like what tone does that have? What emotive quality does it have? You learn that in the moment of using that material, and only that material, to make a piece of work.
Right. That's sort of like a reference. I think that that assignment is meant to sort of convey what the power of the tool can be, like what tonally and informationally the tool can provide. But also, I mean, I like what you said, brevity is the soul of wit, or is that it? I think that's a,
Yeah.
I think that's a like Abraham Lincoln quote or something, because I remember an Abraham Lincoln quote that says, sorry, I didn't have the time to write a shorter letter, because he wrote this like really long letter. Yeah. And it's like, I didn't have the time to like sit down and think of how to like make this more concise. And that's a really cool writing exercise I used to do, where I would just like word vomit, and then I would take however long that was and make it into a page, and then I would take the whole page and make it into a paragraph, and then I would take the paragraph and make it into one sentence. And you will be surprised by how much information you can convey in one sentence. And maybe this is like the like anxious overthinking writer in me, but I will have arguments about word choice, constraining yourself to really think about what is behind every word. I mean, especially in comics, like when you talk about between, like reading between the lines, or reading between the gutters, reading between the panels, I mean, like the implication is the most powerful part of the comic, and possibly in art. So one of the things that I was thinking about when I was writing some notes for this episode was sort of what fan fiction is most successful at, which I think is the power of allusion, not illusion, allusion. referencing things and kind of the inside jokes that come with it. So I was also thinking of parodies, of course, because you can't write about fan fiction without writing about parodying Weird Al Yankovic or South Park or The Simpsons, like comedy comedy is just parody, whereas drama is fan fiction. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
I was thinking about why parody is so successful, and it is what they're referring to. I mean, they're creating this inside joke basically, because what makes it funny is not what is said, but what is applied. I mean, if someone were to make a parody of Michael Jackson, they wouldn't be parodying the music that he's really popular for. They would probably be parodying or referring to some of the other things that he's well known for.
Unless you're Weird Al, in which case you do both.
Yeah, you do. You exactly. Did you ever watch 30 Rock? I wanted to bring this up because I knew we were going to talk about Weird Al.
I've seen a couple episodes. I can't say I'm a fan because I haven't seen much of it, but what I have seen I thought was funny.
Have you seen the Weird Al episode of 30 Rock? Because there is a
not.
Weird Al episode. Okay, so
that's pretty cool.
It's funny. I mean, I really liked 30 Rock when it was on TV, but there was an episode where Jenna, Jen Krakowski's character, she makes a really heartfelt song, and it gets parodied by Weird Al, and she gets really upset about it. She's like, this song was my heart and soul, and it means so much to me, and Weird Al is over here writing a song about eating pizza, and it's upsetting me, and I'm gonna sue him and all this stuff. And she tries to like out parody Weird Al, and as a result, Weird Al ends up making this like incredibly beautiful, like perfect song that just transcends human emotion. And it's like, I think the idea is that when you push parody so far, it's no longer a joke. Like, it actually becomes something very sentimental.
This is reminding me of like meta irony, like the cyclical nature of it, or shucks, not to be political, but even like horseshoe theory. The more you push something and reiterate it, like you're bringing it back to its original essence.
I love that. I love horseshoe theory because I think it's pretty true, and I think that sort of pushing it until it becomes something honestly like either opposite or original. That's exactly what happens in parody and in fan fiction. But what I'm getting at is that, art, parody, satire, and fan fiction, all of these things have a sort of success because of what they refer to or what they allude to, which I think is what artists in general are trying to kind of get at. I think I wrote a blog a couple of days ago, and I wrote about this idea of the implication or the associations, like the emotional associations that come with certain things. And I think like on a subconscious level, artists are trying to tap into that, the association. And I don't know, like it's the power of the inside joke, or like me making, maybe I'm just like really trying to narrow this down too much, but I really think it's just like I'm implying something, and the person, the audience understands that implication, and that is why art succeeds.
I feel like it kind of reminds me of semiotics, which is so dry, I'm sorry, but it's like it's not just the reference, it's like the allusion to the actual thing, the essence of the thing that everyone understands. Like it gets kind of like high concept, but what makes something successful is how it conveys its central theming, And a lot of that success is going to depend on the person that's watching it. But if the person that's watching it understands, the theming that you're alluding to, and it resonates with them, that's the goal ultimately, I think, is resonance. And we use parody, we use illusion, we use copying, we use fan fiction to get to something where whoever is consuming my media, my content, understands what I was getting at, or at least got something out of it that was not intended. But we make fan fiction, I think, because the greater sign, the greater ideal that we're alluding to is this body of work that inspires us. And then you have people who, make their own original content, like their own comics, their own shows, etc. They're trying to do the same thing, but it's kind of harder because they have to build the universe up themselves. But ultimately, it's the same goal. It's like, how do I satisfy the consumer? How can I make my consumer's life more meaningful because they feel that this piece of content is relatable and affirms their identity, affirms their life?
Sure. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and read Harry Potter fan fiction because I don't like Harry Potter. Why would I, try to invest myself as a consumer of art in characters that I don't originally care about, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the problem is, like, how do I make people care about something that they've never heard of before? It's easier if you're all coming from the same community, you all love Harry Potter. It's like, well, it doesn't matter what I write, at least one person's gonna like it. But if you're making stuff like genuinely from your heart and your brain, and like you're going into it without the training wheels on, that's harder. It's like you have to convince people, hey, this is meaningful and you're going to enjoy it. Please just bear with it. Please read this. Please watch this.
Right. And well, okay, so we talked in art school. One of the things we would talk about a lot in art school is this idea of creating in a void and how impossible it actually is to create in a void. Everything is an illusion or a reference to something that we've previously consumed or been interested in and sort of regurgitated in the form of another word vomit frenzy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's talk about our original stories right now. I mean, well, I say original story, you write mostly autobiography.
Yeah, I do.
So and I don't write autobiography. I take things from my life and put them in a blender. This is going to be a reference to an Amanda Palmer quote, so bear with me here, folks. But it was a very good way of putting this, so I'll give her that. The idea of using a blender, I mean, putting all your thoughts and feelings into a blender, and then you either pour it right back out, or you blend it a little bit, like give it a quick chop, and then pour it back out, or you blend it until it's almost unrecognizable, and then you pour it out. And your thoughts and feelings are still there, but it's just in an unrecognizable form. So, for me, my blender just is on the highest speed possible, and I try to get all the personal feelings out of there, I think, because I'm trying to get to something a little more universal, something that I think doesn't have to be named by me, but you're doing something similar. I mean, you're trying to tap into universal feelings, but through the lens of yourself. Please tell me more about autobio, because I don't get it.
Well, autobio is pretty hit or miss for me. Like, when it's done well, I love it, but for the most part, I personally have trouble relating to it. And I do autobio because it's easier, and I'm not afraid of saying that. Like, I understand my own feelings and I understand myself the most, so if I'm going to tell a story, I'm going to use myself as the lens. And at that point, it's like I'm kind of like showing my cards right at the beginning. I'm letting everyone know, hey, I know that, this is about me. I'm not hiding anything. I just wanted to get my thoughts out, and it's easier to use myself as the conduit. A level of it's catharsis, a level of it is simply because of how my brain is wired. It's easier for me to tell my own stories than to come up with new ones. That said, I still enjoy fiction work. It's just harder for me. And the thing is, even in my reading habits, everything I consume is nonfiction. And I don't exactly know why that is, but I love hearing about how the world works in all these different disciplines. Like, I'm very interested in philosophy and physics and astronomy and like science related fields, psychology. All of my books are just like either books on art theory or just anything else I was interested in at the moment. Like, oh gosh, what's that one? Into Thin Air, is that it? By John Krakauer. Like that was just because like I wanted to read it because I'm fascinated with alpinists, and I think that mountain climbing is one of the craziest things anyone could ever do. But really, I have a weird reverence for people who do it. It's fascinating to me. So there you go, another nonfiction book.
I think it's interesting that you say there's going to be a bingo card that says I think it's interesting, because I say that twice a sentence. But I like that you say autobio is easier for you, because I think it's the opposite is true for me. It is so much easier for me to make stuff up, whereas saying it like directly, like this is my experience and this is my past and this is what I've done and what I've thought, that is a level of vulnerability that I think is more difficult than anything I've ever written.
Yeah, that makes sense. I empathize with that, and I imagine that's the case for a lot of people. Like, I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of autobio, like there are very few very vulnerable autobio artists, but a lot of autobio is just like you take your life and you turn it into a character, and it's usually very funny and kind of underground stuff that you'd see at zine festivals, you know?
Right. That I think that falls more into the sort of realm of magical realism. Like someone that I'm thinking of right off the top of my head is like Julie Doucet or Gabrielle Bell, whereas I mean, Julie Doucet, that was autobio, but there was definitely an element of magical realism and comedy to it.
Yeah, like, and I don't want to assume anything, and I don't mean to like, so I don't see it as an insult, but I'm not trying to be insulting. I think that takes away some of the vulnerability. It's like if I just like bear everything, the good and the bad, and like exaggerate it, then like you don't know where I begin and where I end. It's me as a character, but do you really know the authentic me?
Did you end up reading Diary of a Teenage Girl by Phoebe Glockner?
I think I read maybe like the first 3 or 4 pages. You had recommended it to me so much, and I was really like invested in it, but I couldn't read it. I just couldn't.
That's totally fair. I think I remember you saying like I can't read this, and I was like, yeah, that's totally fair. I get it. But the thing with that book that really got me was that it was it's brilliantly done in the sense that it incorporates like journal writing, prose writing, and comics, and it feels so much like autobio, but it's not. And it's really curious because for a good part of the book, I thought it was autobio. Like that is how I think well written and experiential the story can be. And I think that's more kind of what I'm interested in is making this fictional story that feels autobiographical, feels possible, but it's
I think you're getting
totally
that
made up. Yeah.
in my experience reading your comic. It feels like that. I think you're striking a nice balance.
Aw, thank you. Yeah,
You're
I'm not
welcome.
actually, well, I was going to say I'm not actually an alcoholic writer, but that's totally not true. I 100% am. I'm just a recovering alcoholic cartoonist. So a little different.
Yeah, a little bit of a different flavor.
A little sprinkle of something else.
Yeah. Je ne sais quoi, as they say.
Well, so going back to fan fiction, because that's what we're always talking about. Here's something interesting that I came across while I was reading up on fan fiction. The most popular fan fiction ever written is, according to this person on the internet, so it must be true, Dante's Inferno, the Divine Comedy.
Actually, I agree with that. No, that's got to be it. That has to be it. I was thinking when you asked me that question, I was like, I know there's a big one. I was like parsing through my memory. I was like, there's a big one and it's biblical. Which one is it? And then, yeah, Dante's Inferno.
I mean, it hits every chord. It takes a story, and whether or not you're religious, the Bible is a story written by people. And it's a self-insert because Dante inserts himself, and he has real life people fictionalized in his story. So like Virgil, Beatrice, and Saint Bernard are the three guides in the through hell, and they were all based on real people.
I've never read it myself, don't cancel me, but isn't there a moment in Dante's Inferno? I've been trying so hard not to. I feel like I'm having that nightmare again.
Don't take my nightmares from me.
I'm sorry, you can keep them. Those are good. Not quite in my palate. But correct me if I'm wrong, he meets like a philosopher, and the philosopher basically is just like, what? You're the famous Dante. I love your writing.
Yes, yeah, that totally happens. There's a fan insert.
That's what I thought.
I read Dante's Inferno, it must have been like 5 years ago now, and my memory is dodgy at best, but I really liked it. I was surprised by how much I liked it, because I think it hits a lot of very emotional sort of elements in some of the most visceral memories for me are some of the parts of hell that like make my skin crawl. And I would love to do an episode on body horror because of how much that physically alludes to a certain kind of pain that is very interesting to me as a creator. But it is. It's just like, I think Dante's way of exploring what hell means, and it was written at a time when hell was believed to be true by most people.
Mm-hmm.
Did you read Candide? Did I make you read Candide?
It's on my shelf.
Oh my God.
You gave it to me. I've been meaning to.
You know what? You need to read that before next week. It's such a short read. I promise you, you will love it, because it would be really cool to talk about Candide in the vein of satire, because it's one of my favorite books. I mean, it's a classic for a reason. But I'm not going to say much more about it, because I don't remember if Voltaire was a politician or if he was just like making fun of politicians. But we'll just leave it at that. Anyone who's listening, if you haven't read Candide, go read it. It's like 100 pages, and it's fantastic. It's hilarious, and it's depressing.
I feel like a teacher if we're giving a reading assignment, you guys, before you come to the next podcast. Ash will do it with you. Ash shall also read Candide for the next episode.
Please do. At the end of every episode, I'm just going to take a affirmative tone and tell you need to watch or read something ASAP.
I like that. I'm very directionless, and I just bump into things. So when people point me in the right direction, I really appreciate it.
By the way, you brought up Tumblr earlier. I think we're probably getting close to the end of this episode. It's been almost an hour, but I want to bring up Tumblr because I might be getting my internet timelines confused. But it was either Tumblr started it and Twitter copied it, or they both started it around the same time, of this idea of reblogging or retweeting.
I'm actually curious. For some reason, I want to say that Tumblr came first, but I really don't know.
Well, it's really hard to say because they both kind of popped up around the same time.
Right.
But, I mean, one of the things we didn't even touch on when we're talking about copying and satirizing, and we can do a whole other episode on this, is memes. Because memes work, and they're funny because of what they allude to.
I could definitely spend a lot of time talking about memes. I have some very strong feelings on memes, and I don't know why.
Probably because they're a pretty big part of our lives. And the reason I bring up Tumblr and Twitter is because I think that's how they became a big part of our lives. Was when things started getting reblocked and retweeted, they became viral and became memes.
It's so interesting that you bring that up because I remember when I first started using Tumblr. By the way, Twitter came first, a year before Tumblr. When I first started using Tumblr, I was probably like 12 years old, so I was still in middle school. And the way it's formatted is like an endless scroll, so you're constantly given content and you keep going down, and a lot of it is just like humor. It's text posts and images and memes and videos that are supposed to make you laugh. When I first discovered it,
what
mind
Twitter
you,
is, by the way.
yeah, I'm not very familiar with Twitter, but as is, so I'm sure she'll help me fill in the gaps. But I know a lot about Tumblr, and I imagine they're quite similar.
Yeah, they're super similar. I think Tumblr is more of a visual platform, but the concept remains the same, that you can either create original posts or you can reblog other people's posts.
Right. But regardless, like the currency are these images, this content, and a lot of it is usually humorous in nature. Like when I first started my Tumblr, I was probably up for weeks every night, just like scrolling for hours, laughing my ass off because it was the funniest thing I'd ever seen, and it was novel still. Like I came off of like Rage comics and I Can Ask Cheeseburger, and suddenly there's like a little bit more nuance. And then eventually you get sick of that, and the memes need to get more absurd and more nuance. And I honestly have no clue where it's going to go next.
I'm curious because I never became a big meme person. When I used Tumblr in high school, it was because I was an emo, depressed teenager who wrote My Chemical Romance fan fiction, and so my Tumblr was kind of curated to this sort of dark aesthetic and like
yeah.
And
no,
I'm
I get
smoke
that.
cigarettes, and I'm gonna have emotional issues and trauma that's repressed, you know.
But that's another community. Like you find people whose entire style matches yours in this online platform. Like that could be a fandom itself, just like dark aesthetic.
Totally. But that dark aesthetic, I mean, now it's full of memes because I would say probably because TikTok has made like a pretty cool, like, no longer emo aesthetic, because emo kind of died in 2000, I don't know, 9 or whatever. The emo aesthetic died when the Black Parade died. But
I'm gonna cry.
It didn't get, like, we didn't do memes, like, as a former member of the emo community, we didn't do memes until more recently. And I think now everyone is doing memes. Everyone is appreciating kind of the memification of the world.
Well, it's just information, isn't it? And it's like the most conveniently conveyed information. That's the thing. Like, we live in a culture of instant gratification. It's so much easier to get the punchline when it's like 5 words on a tag or a piece of image, you know? Like, it's interesting to me. And I know Richard Dawkins has talked about memes before. I think he's the one who came up with the terminology and the definition of it, etc. But I'm not very well versed in that. I haven't read the book that that's from, but all I know is like it's interesting. I guess in like a formative way, in the way that our society and us as a species continues to evolve and interconnect with technology, like how systems of information are given to us and how we want to receive them. Because I think we like memes for how simple they are. We like memes for being so concise. Like the point comes across without taking up more than like 10 seconds of your time and energy.
I love that you said that. I love that you brought that up. That simplification, because as cartoonists, I'm gonna go ahead and throw this out. We use a combination of words and pictures to convey more than the words can. I mean, that's the whole point of writing comics and using the comics medium, is that we can convey things through the panels and those spaces between the panels that we don't necessarily have to communicate through words. And that's what memes are doing. I mean, that's what makes memes successful is the allusion, the reference, that implication. It's the same thing that we do in cartooning, that simplification, that what is it called, iconicizing of certain things. I mean, there's a reason a fly is always drawn a certain way, an axe is always drawn a certain way, a skull is always drawn a certain way. Whether or not that's what they all look like, that's what iconically we see them all as.
Exactly. I know we talked about this like in conversation, but not specifically on the pod, and I don't want to take up too much more time. But Scott McCloud's triangle of iconic, surreal, realistic, I think is one of the most powerful tools for understanding and breaking down visual information that's ever been made. Like, it's up there with like the color wheel for me. It's crazy to me that he came up with this concept. But every sort of abstraction that we decide to go for in like our cartooning or our artwork is all serving to convey like an inner essence. And depending on if you want to do something more iconic, you're gunning for accessibility. Like, you're not looking for something that's realistically portrayed, literally like a gun or literally like a person's face. Like, it's like smiley face or a little squirt bottle, like an emoji. That's interesting to me, that through levels of abstraction and paring away information, it's actually more universal and easily conveyed and understood by others. Like, I honestly, I would love to spend an entire episode talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about abstraction versus realism, and I remember this great meme where it was like people who were doing hyper realistic art. They were like drawing things so real you couldn't tell that it was a drawing. But then people started just putting objects on a piece of paper and being like, look how hyper realistic it is, and trying to get away with like passing it off as a drawing. And you know that I mean, that's basically, I think, and this is a good point probably to wrap things up, but saying, you know, that illusion, that implication, that shorthand is what probably possibly makes art interesting. And maybe we're just oversimplifying everything, but I think that's what we as cartoonists are kind of aiming for. And this is why every single artist I ever meet, I tell them, you need to draw a comic. Like, just try it at one point and you'll see like what your brain can do within the constraint of the medium, because we are very constrained. I mean, we have paper and pencils and that's it, and it's awesome. I will stand on my soapbox all day and talk about how great comics are.
Oh, I'll happily join you. Like, just cartooning in general. Like, I love all of it so much because, again, it goes back to just conveying information. Like, how are you conveying this concept in a way that as many people as possible can understand it? And that's really cool. That's a level of discipline and skill that I'm not sure everyone really understands. Because, like, you know, with like pop art and modern art or whatever, surreal art, people would like be like, my kid can do that. It looks like scribbles on a wall. And it's like, there's still a level of design there that I don't think you appreciate until you try it yourself. Like, yeah, maybe a Mark Rothko piece looks very boring, but like, try mixing those colors and making the composition.
Oh my
yeah, I love Rothko too. I'm okay with saying that. Like, I'm sure it makes me sound pretentious. I love Rothko.
No, like, talk about that, the implication, like how heavy I feel, like physically heavy I feel whenever I look at a Rothko in person. We'll do an episode on modern art because there's some really weird and cool stuff in the modern art world that I think actually does tie into cartooning on a level.
I would love to. That would be a great episode.
Yeah. Closing thoughts, Ash?
I am not going to go watch 30 minutes of TikTok videos after this. How about you?
Good for you. I am going to go draw, and I'm going to keep watching Futurama because that's what I've been watching, and I love Futurama very much.
Awesome.
I had a lot more that I did want to say, but I think it's just going to be rambling at this point, so we'll cut it off here. I want to give a quick shout out to Divorce Action John. He did the music for the last episode and this episode, He's a great musician. You can check him out on SoundCloud. Yes, I am direct lead with SoundCloud because I think he's that good, and I don't recommend things lightly.
You should trust her. She's got a great opinion on things. And I, too, am a fan of John's work. Thank you for helping us out, buddy. See you next time, you guys.
See you next time.